Hello, Aurora lovers. This is Dale Bone from Dale Bone Imaging, and this is Aurora Hunting 101. Welcome to episode 3. Where in the world can you see the Northern Lights? The answer to where in the world can you see the Northern Lights depends on your location. Aurora are visible across Canada and into the northern United States, northern Europe, and Russia. The problem is, the further south you go, the less frequently they are visible, and they may only be visible low on the horizon. In the best locations, they are visible most nights in the fall, winter, and spring. In the most southern portions of Canada and the northern United States, they may only be visible a few nights a year, or maybe once every few years. Let's take a look at some Aurora visibility maps. Here is NOAA's Aurora visibility map based on KP number. So the KP number goes from 0 to 9. 9 is the upper limit, and 9 happens very rarely. Generally less than once per year, and usually only during the Aurora peak. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But KP3 is fairly common. KP4 is still fairly common. 5 and higher, we're getting into what they call geomagnetic storm conditions, and they happen less frequently. So if we look at this map, KP3 happens fairly frequently up through Alaska, down through northern British Columbia, Alberta, central to southern Saskatchewan, and it dips fairly low in Ontario, Quebec, and then starts curving back up. Like I said, KP3 happens regularly. I live approximately in this area, and if you're willing to go out at, say, between midnight and 3 a.m. on a clear night, most nights you'll see Aurora, because most nights there'll probably be KP3 or KP2, and you can often see KP2, although it will be very low on the horizon. If you live closer to the border or in the bordering Canada and the US, you may have to wait for KP5, and then KP7 doesn't happen very often. We actually had KP8 last month, and people were reporting Aurora. Certainly they could photograph them. There was somebody that photographed Aurora just barely from Florida, but there's also pictures from Arizona. So this is for seeing them, and photographers can pick up dimmer Aurora and just pick up the colors in the sky that you may not be able to see. In my mind, these lines are a little bit conservative, but it doesn't hurt to be conservative, especially when you're first starting out. And if we want to look at Europe, so on the Scandinavian peninsula, you have northern Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and then a little bit of Russia, northern part of Russia. Greenland's actually further up in there. The visibility starts going down as you go further north, and if the aurora is really strong, it tends to move completely further south. So you might not have as good visibility when there's really good conditions if you're in the very far north. But you know, say KP5, which KP5 is the green one, KP7 happens. Now you're into, you know, Ireland and Scotland, almost some of the more northern European countries, and deeper into Russia. If you're in the southern hemisphere, that's not not particularly good because other than Antarctica, which is at the pole, none of the other continents extend very far south. So the places that you sometimes see aurora pictures and sometimes see aurora in the southern hemisphere are Tasmania and the southern coast of Australia, sometimes into New Zealand, and then otherwise you have to be in Antarctica. So if you're on this peninsula in Antarctica, you can see the northern lights as well. But you're not going to see them from South America. And as I said, as the KP number gets higher, they become less frequent. So this only covers the stronger ones, but KP5 happens, this is for 11-year cycle. So the sun goes through an 11-year cycle of activity. We're actually going into the peak of the activity for the current cycle over the next couple of years. So we're more likely to see these higher levels. But it's a 10-year cycle. So KP9 happens 4 times in 11 years. That's not very often. It's, you can divide by 10, so say 40% chance per year. And that happens sometime in a day. So it could happen most likely during the daylight hours, or it could be, if you're in the northern areas, it could be when it doesn't get dark enough at night. It could be cloudy, it could be raining, it could be snowing. There might be really strong aurora and you can't see it. So your chance of seeing KP9 is fairly low. As I said, we had KP8 last month, but it happens significantly more frequently. So if you divide by 10, 6 times per cycle, 6 days per cycle, 6 days per year, 60 days per cycle, approximately. So it can happen multiple times a day, right? So 100 times per cycle or 10 times per year, approximately. But that's going to be biased towards the time when the aurora is more active. So if you're in a KP5 region, it could be 90 days a year, especially going into the maximum. That's not too bad. That happens. That's quite a bit, right? 3 months out of the year, that's fairly frequent. And as I said, KP3 happens really frequently. I happen to live in a place where you can see aurora, maybe not great displays. They'll be up on the horizon, maybe 45 degrees up in the sky. But that's definitely there, definitely visible much of the year. Let's go back to this map again. So, KP9, almost never going to happen. 7 happens a few times a year. 5 happens with some regularity. KP3 happens frequently. If you live in the more northern areas and are patient, you may be able to wait for the aurora to come to you. If you do not live in an area where the aurora occurs frequently or not at all, then you probably want to travel. If you are traveling, then you likely only have a few days or a week to see them. In this case, you most likely want to travel to the center of the auroral zone. This is the area where the aurora occurs almost every day. Unfortunately, they are so far north that it does not get dark enough to see them in the summer and possibly even some of the spring and fall. So should you book that trip to Iceland right away? Maybe. It's on the southern edge of the auroral zone, but it also tends to be cloudy. I don't want to turn this into a travel episode, but some of the best known locations that are relatively easy to get to in geographic order are Fairbanks, Alaska, in Canada, Whitehorse in the Yukon, Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, Churchill, Manitoba, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Russia's in there, but I'm not certain how easy it is to get to northern Russia. The main distinctions between these locations is the travel cost and weather. The locations in Canada will have longer viewing periods due to their more southerly locations. So let's look at a map. The nice people at See the Aurora created this Google map with contour lines for each of the KP levels. In general, you want to hit areas that are KP0 or KP1. That's sort of the resting position for the Aurora when there's very weak solar winds. Let's see how well this works. Okay, so starting with the places I mentioned, if we look at North America, there is a curve. It curves down here quite a bit, and there is a reason for that, but I think I'll not explain it at the moment. So, as I said, Fairbanks, Alaska. Sure, now I can't find Whitehorse. So Whitehorse is a little bit south. It's getting up to the KP2, but it's not bad. And then Yellowknife is actually inside the oval. The visibility starts going down as you get closer to the center of the Aurora. The Aurora is an oval that's hollow in the middle and, donut shaped. So as you get closer to that middle, the visibility actually starts going back down. But you're still close enough that Yellowknife is considered one of the prime spots in Canada, and it tends to have really good weather, or relatively good weather as well. Churchill, Manitoba is the most southerly one of the ones that I mentioned. It's up here. It's a little bit hard to get to, a little bit expensive. There's no roads to it. You can fly, or you can take a old train that takes quite a while to get there because it's going really slow. There are places in Ontario and Quebec, but they're hard to get to. The southern tip of Greenland, again, harder to get to. Iceland has lots of airlines flying to it. And then sort of the Nordic countries in general, Norway, Sweden, Finland, northern Russia. And we end up back in Fairbanks again. And then same thing for South America. There's the southern hemisphere. You're out of luck for South America, Africa, Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand are okay. If you're going to travel to see the Northern Lights, or the Aurora, northern or southern lights, go for the northern ones. And Canada or Northern Europe seem like your best choices. One final graph to look at. This is the graph of the solar cycle. So every 11 years the sun goes through a minimum and a maximum in terms of solar activity. At the maximum there's lots of sunspots and eruptions from the sun, and there's lots of aurora activity. And then 5 years later it declines down to a minimum. Doesn't mean that there isn't northern lights, but they're less frequent. Currently we're 2003. We're above the curve at the moment, which is good. Hopefully it keeps climbing. It's been running above the curve for quite a while now. It looks better than the last cycle, but that's only because the last cycle was pretty bad. So we go back several decades. The solar activity has this trend down. Nobody seems to know why, but there is a fair amount of variation cycle to cycle. Hopefully we're back up at least to cycle 23 instead of cycle 24. But on the plus side, if you're hoping to see the northern lights in the next 3 to 4 years, it's an excellent time to go. To answer the question, there are lots of places to see the northern lights, and Canada is one of the best. As you saw from the solar cycles, we're heading into several years of aurora goodness. If you need to travel to see the northern lights and are in North America, then northern Canada is an excellent choice. If you're in Europe or Africa, then the Nordic countries may be a better option. If you live in one of the higher KP zones, then you may be able to just wait for the aurora to come to you. Please check out episode 4, How Should I Plan for My First Aurora Outing? I'm wishing you clear skies and happy hunting.